Thank you, Imran. And Daniel, it's great to be here with you. So I want to start by underscoring what Imran just said, which is that I'm not here because I have some deep expertise in the conflict in the Middle East. I definitely do not. I'm here because I know something about free speech. I have written a lot about the importance of free speech to democratic societies, and I've litigated a lot of cases involving conflicts or perceived conflicts between free speech and other important values like equality or security. I've also had an unusual vantage point on the student protests relating to the war because I run a free speech institute at Columbia University, which is where the student protest movement began. And I think I want to say something about what happened at Columbia, although I assume that most of you have seen at least some of this. But I want to say something about what happened at Columbia because what happened at Columbia also happened on many other campuses in the United States and around the world. And I think what happened on university campuses is a kind of microcosm of what happened in our societies more broadly. So here's what happened at Columbia. At Columbia, many students demonstrated in solidarity with Israelis after October 7th. Many other students demonstrated in solidarity with Palestinians in the weeks and months afterwards. There were demonstrations and counter-demonstrations. There were allegations of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism. Students set up an encampment on Columbia's campus, and Columbia called in the police department, the NYPD, to dismantle the encampment, and they arrested hundreds of students who were protesting peacefully. Then other students occupied a university building, the same building that students had occupied during anti-apartheid protests in the 1980s. And Columbia called in the NYPD again and arrested those students. So there was this very contentious and divisive debate on Columbia's campus about the war, about Israel and Gaza and what was going on there. But there was also a kind of meta debate about free speech, about how we should and can talk about the war. And the debate around free speech revolved around questions like, what are the limits of the right to speak freely? How do we reconcile our commitment to free speech with our commitment to other values like inclusion? How do we foster cultures in which disagreement and debate are productive rather than destructive? And what should we ask and expect from our institutions in this regard? Not just our public institutions, but from private ones as well, like private universities and publishers and museums and other cultural institutions. But Daniel, your background is very different from mine. You should tell everybody about that.
Well, I guess in contrast to you, Jamil, and thank you, I'm here because I'm so deeply steeped in the intestines of Israel-Palestine. So for me, it's a brief few minutes looking through the microscope end. I grew up in a Jewish, religiously observant Holocaust survivor home. As was mentioned, I get elected to become president of the World Jewish Students, move to Israel, become a dual citizen. In my military service, I'm pulled into the negotiations under then Prime Minister Rabin with the Palestinians. I served later in the government of Ehud Barak as a political appointee, a senior advisor, again back in the negotiations during the end of the Clinton presidency. So I'm an average-aged European. And Clover was about 1 year old when I was doing that. And in addition to the close friendships I built with Palestinian counterparts in those talks, what that negotiating experience made clear to me, if I was going to get this right, I would have to develop a deep familiarity with the layers of experience and the lived realities and perspectives of Palestinians. So my professional life has been about conflict resolution, but also about how to speak on this conflict and to this conflict in different spaces. I worked for a period in America, in Europe, in think tanks, and increasingly my work is how does this issue relate to the global south? So I've been invited in recent years by Kenya and China, by their governments, as well as Germany, to brief the UN Security Council. When October 7th comes, many of my Israeli friends have losses, friends and family. I have a distant cousin who is a hostage. Within days, the ability to focus exclusively on that pain becomes unsustainable. As Palestinian friends raise the alarm, what are Israeli leaders telling us about what they're going to do to Palestinians? Within days, they're telling us that food, fuel, water, electricity will be cut to all people. And by the end of October of last year, more Palestinian children have been killed in Gaza than are killed across the world in all conflicts in any regular year, according to Save the Children. A mass bombing campaign, schools, hospitals, and it has not yet let up. And for over a year now, we've been looking at the same event and seeing different things. And so you started to speak, Jamil, about how the institutions, the spaces that you work in, have been dealing with those kind of cognitive gaps. Take us to the next stage of how are they doing?
Yeah. Well, so I guess my view is that the institutions that we really need to foster a culture of free speech have failed us over the past year. Since October 7th, 2023, there's been this tidal wave of censorship and suppression, mostly of pro-Palestinian voices, but sometimes of pro-Israel voices as well. Universities suspended student groups, they imposed new restrictions on the right to protest, they canceled film screenings and public events, they limited access to campuses. Museums canceled artist exhibitions and journals withdrew articles. Bookstores canceled readings and debates. Some of the biggest law firms in New York City said they would not hire students who participated in protests. I think to find a historical analog to all of that, you need to go back all the way to the McCarthy era, when the House Committee on Un-American Activities was trying to root out suspected communists in universities and in Hollywood. Now, that isn't to say that this wave of suppression has been entirely effective. Plainly, it hasn't been. Many people continue to speak out about the conflict. And in some cases, the suppression has been a catalyst for dissent. That's what happened on Columbia's campus. But I think it's fair to say that this wave of suppression has had a real and even profound effect on the willingness of ordinary people to engage. Everyone knows that engaging publicly on this topic is perilous. Every word is closely policed, and a misstep can have significant professional and personal consequences. You may notice that both Daniel and I are talking with notes. So unsurprisingly, many people are fearful of engaging on this topic. They don't engage publicly, and my sense is that they don't engage privately either. And the result of that is that we're not having conversations that we need to have. Why do we need to have them? I think because if we don't have these kinds of conversations, we end up, as Imran intimated earlier, retreating into echo chambers and becoming more polarized. And we cut off the possibility of social change. We know from our own history that social change isn't possible without people changing their minds. And the only way people change their minds is to encounter others who have views different from their own. Every social movement that you can identify grew out of encounters with difference. And I think that's what we are missing right now. But Daniel, does your experience conform to what I just described?
Yeah, I mean, largely, and I am trying to think about this question of how do you unpack this polarization. And from where I'm coming from, it begins with, look, this is war. War is about disinformation campaigns. It's about psychological warfare. Now we also have the added joys of the algorithm. There is, and this mustn't be lost on people, there is a vast asymmetry of power between Israelis and Palestinians over there, but it's mirrored in terms of who has access to power over here. So for me, part of the story is that Palestinians and those who are Palestinian adjacent often feel overwhelmingly disempowered. And in those rare spaces where the tables are turned on that dynamic, student councils, a patch of grass on a campus, maybe a football stadium, there can be an excess in the other direction. To be parochial for a moment, something that features prominently for me and is often lost in these binaries is that Jewish people are not a monolith. Unsurprisingly, there's no single opinion and there are deep ruptures, and some of you may have been exposed to that. The attempt to impose a uniformity of thinking around Israel goes against the grain of all Jewish history. As with other peoples, different ideas have always competed for the hearts and minds of Jewish people. There's no single truth. Now, for any state, including Israel, it makes sense to instrumentalize the assets they have for their own PR and messaging purposes. And there has been an instrumentalization by Israel of Jewish experience and communities, even a weaponization of anti-Semitism. Now, I argue that's not good for Jews. Anti-Semitism is real and serious. Protesting against mass killing, marching for peace, is not anti-Semitism. I'm sure it's not always a comfortable conversation for people to be pulled into, but it is absolutely legitimate for Jews or anyone else to question what is going on there, what is Israel doing, what Zionism means for Palestinians, etc. And then for Palestinians, and not just for Palestinians, but many other people of color, indigenous people, people in the global south who have lived through colonization, settler colonialism, liberation struggles, apartheid, they look at this and see something very familiar, often seeing themselves in the Palestinian story of displacement, rights denial, structural violence and inequality, and a struggle for freedom. The sense of a life less valued by the West. And of course, the often experienced recourse to Islamophobic discourse. Now, for me, if we're going to do better, we have to be able to hold this space for complexity. So easy last one, Jamil. How do we do better?
Well, okay, so I think if we're going to open up the space for these kinds of conversations, a couple things have to happen. First, our institutions have to create space for them, which takes a kind of civic courage that is unfortunately in short supply right now. It takes a kind of civic courage for a Jewish cultural institution to invite pro-Palestinian speakers to speak at their events. And it takes a kind of civic courage for, say, a progressive bookstore in New York to host readings by people who describe themselves as Zionists. But we desperately need that kind of civic courage at the institutional level. At the individual level, I think we need to afford each other a kind of interpretive charity. And that's a phrase that I learned from a friend of mine, Genevieve Lakier, who's a professor at the University of Chicago Law School, interpretive charity. We need to resist the very human tendency to understand our opponents in the least generous way. There's been this debate, as Daniel alluded to just a second ago, about slogans and symbols. For example, Palestine shall be free from the river to the sea, or the Palestinian keffiyeh. The truth is that political speech is often emotional and ambiguous and susceptible to more than one interpretation. That's especially true when it comes to symbols and slogans. A phrase like river to the sea doesn't have a single fixed meaning. People use phrases like that in different ways and for different reasons, and people hear them in different ways too. That's true of Palestinian symbols and slogans, and it's true of Israeli symbols and slogans as well. Some Jews hear "River to the Sea" as a call for genocide. Some Palestinians see the Israeli flag as a symbol of their people's dispossession and even elimination. It's very tempting to give your opponent's statements the least charitable meaning, but productive engagement, I think, requires just the opposite. So I don't want to pretend that these conversations are easier than they are. They're not easy, but they're necessary. And I know this from my own personal experience. So a long time ago, 25 years ago, I was a clerk on the Supreme Court of Canada, just after I graduated from law school. This was the year 2000, which happened to be the year that the Second Intifada broke out. And I was very sympathetic to the Palestinians. I had a friend, a co-clerk, who was very sympathetic, equally sympathetic to the Israelis. And we used to argue all the time, sometimes pretty viciously. To be honest, I didn't always formulate my arguments in the most sensitive way, and he didn't either. I definitely regret some of the things I said, and I'm very grateful that this was before the era of social media and before all of our statements and conversations were recorded in massive permanent databases. But we learned a lot from each other. And at the very least, we came to understand better where the other person was coming from. And both of us changed our minds about some things, changed our minds in those conversations, and have changed our minds since as well. And I worry that those kinds of conversations aren't happening right now. But let me ask you the same question. What should we be doing differently?
Well, look, for me, because I think about over there, the starting point has to be a better future for both peoples in the Holy Land itself. And that means you can't go with zero-sum approaches. There cannot be a future for Israeli Jews at the expense of Palestinians or vice versa. A vision of greater Israel without rights for Palestinians, which is more or less today's reality. The only river to the sea politics that exists is that. The relentless settlement expansion, West Bank, plans to resettle Gaza, all that should be considered beyond the pale. But if I zoom out, then when I think about this, what I've seen in the last year is that one of the obstacles to more constructive engagement is also how this is covered in our own media, and to acknowledge the limitations of the media echo chamber in the West. So check how you're being influenced. Does the coverage offer context, or is it decontextualized? Does your media outlet have people on the ground in Gaza? Are you hearing Palestinian voices or Lebanese? Are you aware of how many Palestinian journalists have been killed in this last year telling this story? Is an Israeli narrative very familiar, but a Palestinian narrative outside of your comfort zone and treated a priori with suspicion, or vice versa? And again, to flip it, in the global south, it looks very different. Are Jewish or Israeli perspectives being heard? Beyond the West, a narrative of decolonization resonates in very immediate and tangible ways. And I know this can get scary to talk about. My own experience is that processing this with people who care, whether Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, or none of the above, it does involve an investment of time and empathetic listening. And if none of that convinces you, then all I've got for you is this issue isn't going away. And it isn't going to get any easier. And I respect Imran for bringing this into this space. And we will need to challenge our preconceptions. And if I end by looking briefly through the telescope, then where there is war in the Middle East or elsewhere, then the most destructive industries are benefiting. And we're not focusing on those things that we've heard on the stage today, on the climate crisis, on building a regenerative economy, and on social justice. Thank you so much.